Good morning, everyone. My name is Gail Cardew, and I'm Vice President of EuroScience, and I'm also Chief Executive of the Linnean Society in London. And I just really want to welcome you all to this session. Welcome to the panelists and also to all the attendees. And it's been great to see you already introducing yourselves in the chat function. So keep that going. I hope you're going to really interact with us as this session goes along, because it's really lovely for us to see and hear from you all about there and hear your views and your questions. So please keep that coming as we're going along. I'll try and do my best to moderate all the speakers and also look at all the chats. So I will try and do my best, but apologies if I do miss some of the questions that come in, but please do just carry on with your lovely chat. So I'm now going to introduce the rationale and the background to this session, and then I'll explain the format of the session and introduce the speakers. So first of all, the background. So when the organisers were planning this session, they were thinking around the interaction between academia and research and the Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 to focus our attention on the most pressing global challenges that we're facing. And I think all of you will agree that whilst over the last year or so, the COVID pandemic has revealed our vulnerability, it has also shown the fundamental importance of science and scientific knowledge and the need to limit our resources sustainably. So I think, in other words, the need for science in society has never been clearer, but also rarely so contested. So this session is going to be focused on the question of how academic research in all disciplines across universities and research institutes can be used to support the SDGs effectively, but whilst at the same time maintaining a curiosity-driven approach, which is the core of sustainable academia. So with this in mind, it's important to understand not only what academia is good at, but also discussing this session at the board meeting of EuroScience. One of our board members, I think, put it really nicely, and she said, hang on, where is it? She said, is there an alignment or a misalignment between the needs and priorities of academia and those of society? So I think that's really kind of, one of the core questions that we might be addressing in this session. So we're going to be organising this discussion part of this to address three separate questions. So when we come to the discussion, they'll be in these three chunks. The first chunk will be around the expectations of academic research. What really can we expect academia to deliver in the context of the SDGs? The second chunk will be around how we translate that research, if you like, into the policy community. So what can we expect from academia in terms of communicating with policy makers? And then the third section will be around how we can, how do we enable the research on the SDGs when we know or understand that the critical access to some of the data can be restricted by some other interests, for instance, economics, privacy and military research and strategic purposes. So those are the kind of three core sections that we'll be introducing in turn. So now I'm going to go on and introduce the speakers. So first of all, what we're going to have is a short presentation which will be given by Christina Moberg, who is the president of the European Academy's Science Advisory Council and Professor Emeritus at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. So Christina will give us a presentation for a short few minutes. I'm going to introduce all the speakers actually right now, if you don't mind. And then we will have a discussion with Janet Herring, who's the director of the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology and professor at the Swiss Federal Institutes of Technology in Zurich and Lausanne. And Goran Thompson, who is Professor of International Health Systems Research at Karolinska Institute and member of the Health Systems and Policy Research Group linked to Medical Management Center at the Department of Learning, Informatics, Management and Ethics at Karolinska Institute. It's a bit of a mouthful, sorry. Sorry for the captionist who's having to transcribe that. I said that quite quickly. And also Goran Finveden, sorry for the mispronunciation, who's Professor of Environmental Strategic Analysis at the Department of Sustainable Development, Environmental Sciences and Engineering at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. And then finally, at the very end of the session, we're going to have a summary from Ibon Santiago, who is an early career postdoc in biotechnology at TU Munich. So welcome everybody, and thank you all of you for agreeing to participate in this, which I hope will be a very lively session. So if we can now start the presentation of the main key issues. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you very much, Gail. Yeah, we are here today because we are facing major global challenges, and the scale of these challenges is in fact enormous, and many experts even argue that survival of our civilization might be under threat. So therefore major efforts are needed for humankind to have a secure and stable future. So these challenges concern, for example, the climate change and the need to control and mitigate its effect. They concern access to sufficient energy, renewable energy sources, and their which lack the negative effects of climate and environment. And they concern the Earth's growing population with clean water and nutritious food, which should be grown under sustainable conditions. And not least, they concern our health and well-being, which in fact are very much linked to the state of the planet. The EU has committed to make it a priority to respond to these global challenges by adopting the Agenda 2030 and implementing the United Nations 17 Global Sustainable Development Goals in its policies. Our political leaders thus have to make decisions which fulfill these obligations, and such decisions require insight into complicated scientific issues. The crucial role of scientific progress and evidence in solving all these problems cannot be underestimated. Because the society will only benefit if decisions are based on scientific knowledge. Without scientific support, political decisions may have unexpected and even harmful and negative consequences. We see today that governments continue to subsidize fossil fuels and other environmentally harmful practices like overfishing, and to invest in damaging activities which undermine rather than protect the natural capital. Scientists and universities play a vital role here by providing factual evidence to politicians and policymakers. But this is not always trivial. I know this from my experience as president of the European Academy Science Advisory Council, as Gail mentioned, ESAC, an independent network of academies of science within the EU member states, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. Scientists and politicians work under different time horizons. Scientists may spend years on a problem, whereas politicians work within tight time frames. And whereas scientists stress uncertainties, politicians want precise answers. There is an urgent need to bridge this gap. But I would say that the most important role of scientists and universities is no doubt to provide society with new knowledge, because we don't have all the knowledge to solve all the problems that need to be solved. But this does not mean only research directly aimed at solving the global problems, but research forming a knowledge basis that can be used to solve specific problems in the future. Because we often do not know which exact knowledge will be needed to solve a particular problem. Basic research must remain a major issue for the universities and for scientists. The topic for today's discussions and the questions that have been posed are really urgent. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christina, for giving that really helpful background. and providing the more detail on the context of this session today. And it's really triggered some thoughts in my mind as you've been speaking, so thank you. So we're now going to then move to our first kind of basket of discussion, which is around the expectations of academia and the way that academia operates currently. So maybe Goran Thompson, would you like to give me some of your thoughts on this area first, and then I will turn to the other two panelists as well.
Thank you, Gail. Happy to. Now, let's not forget that 6 years ago, quite unique phenomenon happened. All world leaders came together and agreed on the UN Agenda 2030. And the 17 SDGs, 169 targets, 230 indicators. This is indeed a complex adaptive system. You need to apply systems thinking. You need cross-disciplinary approaches. You know, the SDGs, they could be looked upon as a survival kit for mankind. This is serious business. It's about both enlightening the public, and I'll get back to that in the next session, but also using the resources we have at universities in a wise way. We have to break silos. And I'll finish with this first question, or rather statement, in what you referred to, Gail. Namely the relationship between curiosity-driven research and other type of more needs-driven. I don't like that terminology, by the way, needs-driven. Whose needs? Who defines the needs, etc. It's a moral, ethical, and political issue. Now, the COVID-19 unveiled global inequities. It also gave opportunities for those of us that represent health. And in a way, health has been marginalized. Due to various reasons, for example, that climate and environmental researchers have been very skillful in communicating with media. We'll get back to that. But health, in effect, now with COVID-19, regained its position. And I'll finish with these three clusters that we need to think about when we talk about interlinkages and what needs to be done to understand, explain, and affect the interlinkages. That's the economical cluster, the societal cluster, which includes health, and the biosphere. And interestingly, and you know, science is curiosity driven. All types of science is curiosity driven. It addresses complexities. And some of the interlinkages have synergistic effects. Huh? So improvement in one SDG leads to improvement in other. But others have trade-offs, which means improvement in one have negative effects on another. So maybe we'll get back to that. So thank you, Gail, over to you.
Thank you. And I just was reminded, actually, we had a preparatory call in preparation for this, and you mentioned that actually each one of these topics that we could discuss would be the theme, could be the theme of an individual session, because the topic is so enormous. There's so much to unpick in this discussion, so we'll try our best. Janet, can I just turn over to you now and give you the floor just for a few minutes, just to give me your thought, or to give everyone your thoughts before we sort of become more informal and break into a Q&A session.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. So I'd like to very much second Goran Thompson's comments that we have to break out of the silos that academics tends to function in. There's a reason that the disciplines have persisted for so long, and they certainly have value. But in terms of addressing the very complicated and difficult problems that Christina Moberg alluded to, disciplinary thinking is simply not going to be sufficient. And we really need to develop some openness within the academy for that. I think we also need to think about how we work with partners outside the academy. There's some things that the academy can deliver. We should be delivering the best possible information we can in a way that is clear and based on evidence and doesn't minimize the uncertainties, but also doesn't allow uncertainties to overwhelm the information itself. But at the same time, we need to work with partners who are going to participate in the implementation, but possibly also in that communication. If we expect the university to absolutely everything by itself, we're probably going to fail. We should concentrate on our strengths and make sure that we connect with partners who can help us to leverage our strengths. And then the last thing I'd like to mention is that in terms of curiosity-driven research, somehow in the context of actionable research, it's already been mentioned that a lot of the demands of the future cannot be anticipated. And it is exactly the curiosity-driven research of today that will be providing those answers. But at the same time, we need to take advantage of what we already know. A friend of mine and somebody I admire very much, Marcel Tanner, he's the president of the Swiss Academy, said, "We'll never know everything, but we always know enough to do something with the knowledge that we have already." And just to try and push action out into the impossible future where we actually know everything it's a cop-out. So I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, just trying to, in my head, imagine a future where we all know everything. That would be really boring, huh? How would we stimulate the next generation of young people to go into research if everything was already known? That's anyway. So Goran Finfident, would you mind giving us your thoughts as well, just for a few minutes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the role of academia in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is very important and interesting. And I think we can do a lot more better. We can do better in research by developing solutions, but also analyzing the goals and analyzing what is behind the goals. What should we focus on beyond 2030 as well? In education, I think we can do a lot more. We know that businesses expect future leaders to be knowledgeable and to be able to work with sustainability. For sure, they need sustainability specialists, but they really expect everybody that they hire to be knowledgeable in these fields. And this is something, an area where we can do much better to educate all our students in sustainability. I think we also can do much more regarding collaboration. I think we can work with stakeholders that can support sustainability much more. We can avoid some stakeholders which clearly are not working in the interests of sustainable development. We can also provide platforms, meeting places for meetings between different stakeholders. Academia can provide sort of a neutral platform. We can be mediators for knowledge. Research will bring new knowledge to the table, but all the knowledge that we already have. Academia has an important role there in gathering the knowledge and mediating the knowledge. So I think we can do a lot more also in that area, and in that way creating impact in a number of different ways, through research, through education, through collaboration. But since time is running and it's only 9 years left to 2030, and the climate crisis is really urgent, our usual ways of creating impacts are perhaps slower than that. So we also need to be innovative in understanding how can we create impact also with a shorter time frame. I think working with partners, as Janet was mentioning, is important there. I also think leading by example is an important area. Also, universities and academia need to work with their sustainability work, their sustainability impacts, to try to minimize those and show good examples. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to open up a more kind of discursive format now. While I keep my eyes on the chat, so everybody out there, please do give us your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions, your Q&A, your questions in the chat function. Panelists, I'd like to sort of invite you to imagine that we're just sort of around a table, and so therefore be very just don't wait for me to introduce you. Just chat amongst yourselves. But if I could just ask you to limit your chat at the beginning just around the first basket of questions around the expectations of academia. Now, to start you off, I'd like to maybe start with build on a comment that Janet, you said about the concentrating on the strengths of academia. And I know that you've previously spoken about mission creep. And maybe we expect too much of academia. So if I can just ask you to all of you, like I said, chat amongst yourselves, panelists, and I'll keep my eyes open for questions coming in from the audience.
Well, maybe I'll start, since the mission creep was with my phrase. What I see is that we tend to try and build up competencies within academics, within universities, and sort of expand our role. And then we run into two problems. One is that the people who are attracted to academic life are not necessarily the best people at, for example, communicating with politicians or working as sort of knowledge brokers, that is at this interface between science and policy. And the second problem is that there are really, really a lot of people who are very good at that, and they are outside the university and they're already doing it. Right? And the question is, how could we tap into that competence? How could we have a sort of ecosystem of science policy exchange, as opposed to these ideas of tunnels or chains of information flow, so that we can really get a back and forth discussion going? Thanks.
If I can jump in there, I think your point is very good and interesting, but I think we should definitely work with partners who are skilled in communicating, and work with different, help creating different platforms. I think, I mean, the IPCC is an obvious example. The platform that Christina Moberg is sharing is another example, where the academic sciences are coming together to provide synthesis reports, etc. But I think it's important also to remember who we are working with. I think it easily becomes an issue that we work with partners who have resources. And since we know that the future is under-resourced by definition, future generations are very poorly organized, they have limited financial capabilities. It's important also to remember those poorly organized and poorly resourced stakeholders, future generations, poor people, etc. And I think academia have a role there also to remember these groups and play a role there.
Yeah, we could also pay them.
Let me jump in and take a little bit a different perspective. I strongly believe that the tone has to be positive. I also think that there is reason for optimism, but only if the academia is innovative. And of course, it depends on many things, partly on funding, Göran, but also on leadership. You know, you have to create enabling environments in quite often very conservative institutions that allow transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, whatever we call it, approaches. And these approaches are absolutely essential if we want the transformation that is necessary for humankind. I used the survival kit metaphor, and I strongly believe in it. Now, if we do not manage to attract the brilliant young people, then it's a big problem. But then communication needs to, be positive, needs to create this inspirational environment. And I hope that we can get back to that a little bit. I want also to mention, I don't want to talk too much about Karolinska Institutet, obviously, but there are opportunities, there are movements, there are processes in the Stockholm region, which Göran, my namesake, is aware of. The Stockholm Trio, the Stockholm University, and the Royal School of Technology and Karolinska Institutet joined hands. And I think that similar, networking alliances should come. And finally, we need to influence the EU and European community. We need to influence how the texts in the Horizon Europe are being written in order to better match the major challenges that we face over the coming, let's start with 9 years. Thank you, and over.
If I could just interject with some chat that's some comments in the chat space, which are around funding. So we have Biljana, who's said, I think that academia can work really well only with good funding for research. In my opinion, risky creative ideas should also be supported through funding. And then Jana has responded saying, I think partnering with partners who have the resources, brackets money, may be deadly for the freedom of academia. Money should not dictate the science. So I just wondered if maybe if the panelists could just comment on this idea of funding and funding with strings, if you like, with ties and limitations of research.
That's a very dangerous.
In the context of the SDGs, obviously, not generally throughout.
That's a dangerous avenue. And funding is a tool, and we need to be good enough to generate funding without bonding with those that may hinder what is needed. That's my opinion.
So I think that my comment about working with partners might have been a little bit misinterpreted in the sense that we would be working with the partners that have the resources. And here I have to say, I very much appreciate the strong support that the Swiss government provides to research and education. So this is not a comment that every leader of an educational or academic institution could make. But we at EuroVag, we have the resources to work with partners that don't, right? And I think that we have an almost an obligation to do that and to make sure that when we're asking our partners to really contribute in a material way to a project, that they also get financial support for it. Academics, can use their time for various purposes at their own freedom, but that's not true for people who are working in a different environment. And I think we need to bear that in mind. The other thing is that EuroVag, the institution that I'm in the head of, the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, we do a lot of actionable research. We do a lot of research that is done together with stakeholders, different levels, different types of projects, different timescales of impact. But this is something that is also intellectually very, very engaging for our scientists. It's not only blue sky research that is creative and exciting and engaging, it's also applied research or actionable research. And I think that's something that the young people are really interested in doing, and we should give them the opportunity.
Thank you. I very much agree with what has been said. I think if for many universities, for many academians, the reality is that we are dependent on external funding. And I think an important aspect there is that there should be many sources of external funding, so a pluralistic view there, so that good ideas, risky research that perhaps is not possible to get funding from one resource could find it from another source. I think that's a pluralistic funding situation is very important. Thank you.
That's great. I was actually thinking until you said that, about whether or not I'm not an academic researcher, so I'm coming at this from the outside looking in, if you like. So I was actually wondering if the concept of having academic freedom was actually not possible, because funding, surely whoever's giving you the money has always got some kind of strategic priority. Yeah, go on, Thompson.
One of my favorite equations is as follows: performance equals motivations/incentives times competence divided by barriers. And we need to think about all these things in relation to the topic we're talking about. Competence is obviously needed. Incentives are also needed. And then the inverse relationship to, for example, administrative barriers also need to be addressed. Thank you.
So I'd like to turn the attention to a comment that's come in from the chat from Camilla, who says, collaborating does not mean letting others do the work or paying for it, but it means really working together on jointly identified issues, listening to each other and paying mutual respect. The respect of others' competence of importance to solve challenges is what we mostly lack. Would you like to respond to that? I see you nodding your head.
No, it's wonderful, huh? It's the human side of it all, moral, ethical, but human side. And I speak English, not English. Huh? Collegiality, is that the word in English? Huh? And of course, it means trust. You need to trust your neighbor. You need to open up a bit. You need to take risks, breaking disciplinary borders, etc. And it's easier to follow the path that you've been following in a successful way for maybe 10, 15 years. But if not, academicians can do this, breaking the silos, being innovative, addressing the real mega trends in society. Who can we expect? Business, yeah, sure. But academicians need to innovate.
I think it was well put in the comment. Collaboration takes time, and we need time to listen to each other and learn from each other. If we talk about collaboration within academia, I think it is very important in order to solve the pressing issues we have in front of us. I think we all can agree that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research is needed in these areas. And it's important then that if we leave academia alone, I think many researchers will tend to gravitate to the single disciplinary research. We tend to focus on our own issues, our own problems. So there is a need for incentives to work with interdisciplinary research. And I think academia, universities can do much more in creating those incentives. Currently in some fields, some scientific fields, there is counterproductive incentives. Only some journals are counted for when we are talking about promotion, etc. So we need to create more incentives for collaboration. Thanks.
Yeah, I think That's a very important point. It also connects with something Gorham Thompson said, and it connects back to a session that I watched yesterday about scientific culture, academic culture. There are a lot of perverse incentives in academia, really a lot of perverse incentives. We talk about, you know, governments that should back out of funding fossil fuel companies. Okay, that's fine. But what about academics stopping this incredible emphasis on pure disciplinary research for advancement and for hiring? That's something that would be under our control within the academic system. And I think there are steps that are being taken to try and broaden that out, but it's clearly something that is an important barrier for the engagement of people in academic circles in this very important work. Thanks.
Yes, just go on. You just.
May I come with a humble suggestion? We need, again, it relates back to my comment on the tone, optimism, the importance of opportunities. My suggestion would be that EuroScience would consider a follow-up of this, maybe next year, where you focus on positive benchmarks. You know, there are examples out there with the universities that have taken the lead in one area or another. And mind you, I'm not saying that basic research is not necessary and very important for SDGs. On the contrary, it's been alluded to already in this conversation. But why not have a couple of benchmark examples and then try to understand the generalizability of what those universities managed to achieve. Thank you, and over.
That's a great idea. Thank you for that. I think what I would like to suggest, as well as your positive tone, humility as another. I mean, I think generally the majority of scientists that I meet are very humble and very dedicated to sort of science serving society, that kind of concept. But I think that factor exists and coincides alongside a culture of hyper competition, which is also sort of toxic and maybe doesn't fit with that kind of more kind of humility, humble kind of attitude. So I'd like to just to scroll back, we're sort of to a comment that was meant earlier. Again, it goes back to partnerships. Where are we? Oh, here we are. You were talking about collaborating with stakeholders that support sustainability. What do you think about collaborations between academia, stroke research, and climate stroke environmental activism? Any thoughts from the panelists there?
Well, I actually just wrote a short blog piece about this. It was called Freedom of Expression is Not Just for Science. I think there is a really difficult balance to be addressed, and that is that I think it's very important for academic institutions or research institutions to be able to be seen as trustworthy sources of objective information to the extent that objectivity is possible. But that shouldn't prevent individual scientists, even if they are employed at those institutions, to express their political opinions, to be activists if they want to. And that's where the delicate balance comes in. If 100% of your senior leading scientists are strong activists, it's not credible that the institution itself is an honest broker for information. But, you know, to be honest, that doesn't really happen. And I think that trying to be clear about when you're expressing your best evaluation of the science and when you're expressing your own opinions and values, that's not always easy, but we can make efforts in that direction. And I think it actually engages people more if individuals show express what their values are. At the same time, we still have to somehow protect the objectivity of the information that we're trying to provide, that other people also make their own decisions. And this goes along in this direction of modesty. It is not up to us as technical experts to make decisions for society. Thanks.
I think it is important for us in academia to collaborate with many stakeholders. I mean, obviously governments, obviously companies, private interests, and non-governmental organizations, including activist organizations, in order to provide them with the best available science that they can work with and use. Just as we want to provide businesses with the best available science that they can work with, and governments as well. And I think it's important. I think maybe scientists have been a little bit too afraid of being labeled as activists. So I think we should be a little bit more bold in expressing our concerns, not just providing neutral facts without showing any concerns about the implications of them, because the possible implications of the trajectories we're currently on are not good, and we should be clear about that and describe those. Thank you.
Gail, it seems as we are a little bit moving into the next major question, but as this otherwise might be a cliffhanger, at least as I haven't commented on it, let me make a few comments leading into, if you agree, Gail.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to lead into it
the
too.
next question. I like my namesake, Göran's emphasis on being bold. I also like what Janet said. We must be evidence-based. Huh? That's in a way the raison d'etre of universities. So we must be evidence-based. But being evidence-based does not mean that we always agree. I mean, disagreement and skepsis is a foundation of the academia. And that's not what policymakers want to hear. But we need to ensure that climate is still there. Modesty, that's very clear also. Now, if we want to see change, and now I'm moving into the question number 2, an intersectoral approach is absolutely essential. And there are people at WHO, for example, Shyama, Kurovilla, Kumanan, etc., are working quite a lot with intersectoral approaches. But that's not an easy thing, but it is again essential. It is as essential as interdisciplinary approaches. Now, the question whether the university should, join hands with activists, I would quote my behavioral scientist friends, what they normally say when they get a difficult question. It depends. Huh? It depends on the purpose. Now, if the purpose is dialogue, absolutely join hands in a respectful way. But if the purpose is something else, then one needs to be very careful. I'll finish with what I think is necessary. And I'll also quote, or I'll make the source clear. There is a lot of things outside Europe that we could learn from. This is from Pravesh Vase, Thailand. You have difficult problems, mountains. If you want to handle difficult problems, then you need to apply the triangle that moves the mountain. And then you have researchers, knowledge generators in one angle. And in another corner, you have policymakers. And in the third corner, you have the lay public, be it activist or not activist. And you need to get collaboration going. And there are networks for this. There are 18 support tools, how to do policy briefs, how to do policy dialogues, how to communicate in media, etc., etc. EBIFnet will easily find it. And to take a small example, the Swedish coordinator, former health minister Gabriel Wikström, just called a number of university representatives to discuss how it could be possible to develop new programs, which means universities liaise with municipalities or regions, at least in Sweden, where SDG things are happening. It's in the municipalities. Huh? That's the positive benchmark examples. And he has the idea that they should get more of academic, scientific approaches as a basis for their work. Thank you.
Thank you. I really like the fact that we've moved on to question 2 very seamlessly without me having to kind of introduce it. So, so that's really good. I'd like to go back to Goran Fidovan, what you said about we need to be bold in expressing concerns versus neutral facts. And Janet, what you said about honest broker for information. So this sort of neutrality versus expressing an opinion versus decision maker. So again, it's going back to kind of what Christina spoke about at the beginning, which is the sort of different perspectives from academia versus policymakers. So can we just maybe have a few thoughts around the roles and responsibilities of academia versus policymakers, and how that communication or miscommunication, or maybe we should be positive and put our ideal scenarios. What would we like to have in an ideal world?
Well, I think one thing that is really helpful to do is to work with scenarios and sort of the if-then situation. The decision makers need to make decisions, and those decisions are likely to have consequences, and the scientists and experts can spend a certain amount of time thinking about what do they think are the most likely consequences of these decisions, and present that so that people have a more informed basis for the decision. So there's a difference between that, which is not just sort of the facts, but sort of what we see as potential consequences or how things might play out, and saying, we think this is right. So one quick example is that there's an ongoing controversy in Switzerland about the quality of our lake water. And at a certain period, the lake waters became very nutrient rich, some of them. And that was a period where there was a lot of fish. And the fishermen loved this, right? And they look back on that period, which is sort of the 60s, early 70s, as a good time. And now they say, we don't have enough fish, and we need to put more sewage in the lake so that we have more fish, right? And, you know, but there are a lot of complicated things about this. And I think there's a really important role for science to play, but we don't tell the farmers that there should be no agriculture in Switzerland, right? We don't tell the farmers that Switzerland should look as though there were no people here. And there is something where you would say, well, you know, the fishermen have a valid point for them, that they would like to see more productivity in these aquatic ecosystems. It's not up to the scientists to make that decision. It really is up to the society. I'll stop there.
I hope it wasn't the lake behind you, by the way, Janet.
That's the Lake Luzern, the Vierfaltstädtesee.
That's nice. I think that sometimes in discussions about science policy, we tend to have sort of a ideal picture in front of us where science and policy are two separate things that are side by side, and where science role is to provide knowledge and inform policy. But I think it is much more complex than that. I think that science and policy, there are in fact lots of overlaps, because we need to work close, collaborate. There are also a number of actors around this overlap. There are businesses, there are NGOs, there are different stakeholders. And I think we as scientists, or at least as academic institutions, because not every single scientist can do this, but as scientific institutions, we need to realize that this is the reality, and we need to engage ourselves broader in this complex world, and not just sit back and say, I'm just providing facts, and then I'm done. I cannot do anything more and leave it up to the politicians. I think we need to get ourselves more involved. The work with scenarios, I think, is very good. One way of handling this complexity and describe it and illustrate it. So that's a very useful tool in this complex world. Thanks.
Please go ahead, Goran Thompson.
It's very much about respect and curiosity. Now, if we look at the interface between now focusing on academicians and policymakers, looking at the interface, to start with, we have different mandates. And to be clear about the mandate of policymakers and the type of policymaker that we have selected to work with, there are many different types of policymakers, makes it so much easier. You need to understand the customer and vice versa. And I'm surprised by how little investment that has been done in relation to this. I think many positive things are happening thanks to or due to COVID-19. And so there are windows of opportunities here. One of the big differences between academicians and policymakers is the time perspective. Politicians, if we talk about politicians, that time horizon is very short. This 2030 agenda is almost like an ocean of time. I mean, they have a 4-year mandate at best, whereas academicians quite often have much longer. Now, I mentioned the tools and no one picked it up, so I will write the chat in the chat. The network, I strongly suggest that EuroScience shares this. And I also give the name to the person who is now coordinating this from the headquarters of WHO. KI has a collaboration, 5-year collaboration with the created science division of WHO, and EVIPNet is part of that. So there are underutilized tools about exactly what we are talking. And that could be tested in different, I don't know EuroScience. I said the money is not so important. Of course, I don't mean that. But if EuroScience has money, very, very interesting studies could be done on the topic that we are talking about now, in cross-country perspective, with relatively small amount of money. And I think WHO would be very interested. Thank you, Noble.
Thank you. Sadly, EuroScience doesn't have a lot of money. I'll just say that. Just in case, I don't want managing expectations and everything. I just want to bring in a comment from the chat, which is interesting, I think. Would scientists profit from receiving some basic training in the humanities? I just want to say that when I was an undergraduate, I was fortunate as a science undergraduate to have training in science policy, and which was quite interesting. Every science undergraduate had to do some training in science policy, which was very fascinating, putting our research in the context of society. So what are your thoughts on whether or not we need to actually train scientists to look more broadly about the context of their research rather than just the research? Yes, go ahead. I can see you're itching to say something.
Absolutely. And this relates back to the 3 levels of learning. I mean, this has to be injected at universities. We are focusing on research, but we're also talking about the other main task of a university, teaching. You have the informative learning. That's easy. Nowadays, more everybody with IT can do that. You don't need teachers. Then you have the formative, where you add values from the humanities. And finally, you have the transformative learning, which includes leadership attributes to produce change agents. And we need a lot of skilled, evidence-based change agents in the world to solve and handle what is entailed in the survival kit for humankind. Thank you.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm just going to now move the discussion on to the third aspect, which is around the restriction. How does academia deal with situations where access to data is restricted by other interests? Who would like to say something on this third dimension? Military, commercial interests that restrict our ability to have access to the data. Does anyone want to speak a little bit on that? I just wanted to give you the opportunity because that was our third area that we wanted to explore.
Well, maybe I could just mention something quickly, and that is that I think this is certainly an issue. There's no question about that. But I think more and more there is a push towards open science, towards open data, and we can take advantage of that. You know, that even governments, again, you know, it depends exactly what area you're in, how sensitive it is, but a lot of governments are saying, okay, a lot of the data that we collect is not so sensitive. We should push in this direction of making it directly accessible. And funding agencies are also very strong in this push. And so, you know, it's kind of like trying to encourage this initiative and support it. And also for academics, it's not always intuitively obvious for us that we are going in that direction. So that we can add our strength to that. In terms of privacy, there are really a lot of tools to protect privacy when information is used. And I think, again, we need to be sure that everybody is aware of the dangers of violating privacy and the capacity to protect privacy when data is used that involves individuals. But that's not impossible. Thanks.
Anyone else want to say a few things on this? Maybe also on privacy matters and how that relates back to maybe how the public perceive and trust science as an ecosystem rather than necessarily just scientists.
I think this connections to the trust in science is important. And so it connects to also who we collaborate with, importance of choosing partners that we work with, so that we actually can work with open science. I think what Janet was pointing out is very important. Thanks.
This is an area which I'm not so familiar with, but the privacy issue, of course, is part of every ethical application, and especially if you, as I have been working mostly in low and middle income countries, this is a very delicate issue. This takes me back to the previous discussion we had on knowledge in humanities, you know, learning about values, etc., etc. When it comes to defense matters, I just don't know. So I'll rest my case. Thank you.
Well, just one quick follow-up there. So for example, with hydrologic data, stream flows, snowpack, that type of thing, a lot of countries hold that very close. And it's partly because there's economic consequences or implications for having that information. And one way you can argue there is you say, okay, this water year, this hydrologic year, that information has financial or economic value to it. But the past doesn't. The past is over. And so you can start to like inch your way forward. You say like, all right, we understand there's an embargo on this kind of information during the time period where it's economically important. And then once that embargo period is over, things move into an open platform. You can still do a lot with that kind of data. And so, you know, I think that it's always looking for where can you just nudge a little bit into the system to push it forward. I know that the US military released a huge amount of data from submarines at a certain point because they're like, well, we don't care anymore, right? And that put a huge amount of very valuable information into the community for glaciology. And they're just like, yeah, it was important at a certain time. It's not important anymore. And I think you just need to keep pushing.
Yes, go ahead, please speak.
This is a question in the chat, and you encourage us to be interactive. So I thought maybe it's not related to this third question specifically. It's about funding, and it's about horizon. And it's about natural scientists not very much being in favor of all the paperwork. And I can tell you that most of us are not very happy with all the paperwork, but at least my research group, as an example, would not have existed without all the different funded proposals from Horizon Europe. So in a way, you know, if again you don't have so much money, Gail, you said, but I'm sure you have clout and possibilities to influence. And I think we as scientists, we invest too little in you know, working with the funding agencies. We invest too little in trying to influence how funding agencies, especially large ones like Horizon Europe, how they make their calls. And then clearly, you know, if we could also influence the major requirements on management and how to report on milestones and deliverables, that would be a very positive side effect. What I'm trying to encourage here is engagement from scientists, from universities, in influencing what's going on in Brussels. I think that is very, very important. And as you know, more and more will be SDG related. More and more will be SDG related. I was at a meeting 2 years ago when it was made in Brussels, where this was made very, very clear.
Yeah, and I think, Goran, what EuroScience brings doesn't necessarily have the funding, and it does have the clout, but it has the convening power.
Absolutely.
And not just, when I say convening power, sometimes people think it's just the convening power of really important people. And I think what EuroScience stands for is the voice of the ordinary researcher, if you like, and particularly early career researchers, making sure that multiple voices are heard in this discussion, rather than necessarily just a small few leading actors in the space. So when I say convening power, I think what I mean is a more rounded view of the landscape of not just academia, but actually all players in the professional space of science in its broadest definition. There was a very interesting question, I thought, actually, Martin at the end, which I just want to bring this in because we don't have much time left, but I think it's a really interesting question. Talking about open science, how do we avoid actors with stronger means exploiting it in their favor at the cost of others, eventually leading to increasing inequalities rather than in reducing them? Anybody got any thoughts about kind of inequalities and whether the system we have promotes inequality or reduces it? Just some thoughts, some questions. Very good question from Martin, thank you.
I think unfortunately in a lot of the Western US, the Western Europe world, we're in a winner takes all kind of environment. And figuring a way out of that is going to be the only way really to address these inequalities. I think that one of the important things in working with, we do a lot of work with low and middle income countries. And one of the things that's very important for us is that these are shared projects, and that the collaborators from low and middle income countries that we are helping them to develop their capacity, and eventually they move off on their own. We had one super effective collaborator in Thailand, and with funding joint with us with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the next round he had his own grant from the foundation and we weren't involved. And that is fantastic, you know, but things need to go in that direction. It needs to be very thoughtful and deliberative. Thanks.
Yes, please, go on.
It's a brilliant question with a difficult to answer, and I don't pretend to have an answer to it. But you know, the last couple of decades have seen fantastic improvements when it comes to human health. This is pre-COVID. I mean, halved child mortality, for example. But even pre-COVID, inequalities increased. And inequalities is a major driver of many negative things. And if you look at some of the SDGs, not only SDG 1 and SDG 2 or SDG 16, institutions, corruptions, etc., all being interlinked. If we don't address these issues, then there will be major difficulties. Sorry, not least environmental difficulties, migration difficulties, etc., etc. So the question is, how does this openness potentially contain inequalities, or at least manage not to see them increasing year by year? A great question, and I will put it in the hard disk and reflect on it. And I don't, I hope that we will have an opportunity, Gail, to have a continued dialogue at some stage after this with some of the key questions. And I do think this is such a key question. Thank you.
Absolutely. There's a different Martin a comment in which I will read. It's not a question, but it's a comment, but I wanted to read some comments. Data restrictions certainly leads to increase. Will get access to data. This is certainly true regarding data from the marine realm that is considered of strategic relevance. That sounds like the at least. So,
sorry, can you? I think we lost you there for a few seconds. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Data restrictions certainly leads to increased inequalities, since only a few with the right connections will get access to the data. This is certainly true regarding data from the marine realm that is considered of strategic relevance. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I mean, sure, data restrictions increases inequality. Yes, so that is, so it's clearly very important to work with open science and keep, as Janet put it, keep pushing for more open data and in different areas.
Yes, Goran, please.
It's also very much related to university partnerships, university networks, etc. Let's just imagine that each university that is represented in the EuroScience decides to partner with one low and or middle-income country university. Just imagine that. And as part of that transparent, trustworthy, and innovative collaboration, data sharing, building up different data sets, be it marine, health, whatever, that would make a difference. And one should never underestimate opportunities. And I don't know, do you know right offhand, Gail, how many universities are represented at this conference?
I don't. All I know is from Julie at the beginning saying there were 600 people registered. Yeah. So I imagine it's.
So if there is any opportunity for you or other organizers, I would do a quick landscaping and look at the list, and maybe also ask, because this is such an important issue. Ask which universities. Obviously, Janet has collaboration and her group with low and middle income countries, and certainly Karolinska Institute also has. It might be quite a nice map, and then to see until the next EuroScience meeting, what are which type of partnership, how is data sharing, what kind of joint databases, etc., etc. It would lead to, I think, a very interesting session next year. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting. And on that note, I think I need to start drawing the discussion to a close because for us to kind of pause and think about that last comment, those last comments. So what I'd like to do now, I'm not going to, as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to summarize this session because we have Ibon Santiago here with us, who's been listening, I hope, very intently to the discussion. And from an early career point of view, I think it would be really lovely now to hear your reflections on this discussion and actually what you've taken away from it, and perhaps also, if you've prepared this, some of the things that you would like to see changed or acted upon going into the future. So let me hand on to you, and then I will do some closing remarks at the end. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for such a stimulating panel discussion. Yeah, I mean, in the research environment in academia, there are many people, including myself, who are committed to development, these sustainable development goals. So to what has been discussed here, I mean, I agree with most of what has been said. Perhaps I would like to add a couple of points. Regarding how academia can contribute to the development of these goals. So I think academic institutions and academic research can contribute and should contribute what it does best, that is research and education. And it has been commented here that academic institutions can contribute to this debate by providing evidence-based recommendations and solutions, different pathways towards developing these goals from a neutral and objective point of view, right? And they can develop and monitor the implementations of these goals, right? Another point that has been discussed here, and I think it's very important, that is that the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not isolated in a single domain, but as Goran Thompson described, it's a complex adaptive system. I think that beautifully explains the complexity of the problem, and how academic institutions can address this is by having environments where different domains can come together, right? So not only cross-disciplinary research, but this is also like an international problem, right? So international collaborations. So open, transparent, and active collaboration across disciplines and across institutions. That's very important. It has been mentioned here that, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic has set an example of how this has accelerated the engagement of academic institutions with policymakers, or the transfer of knowledge from academia to industry. So perhaps this can set the example of how we can achieve these sustainable development goals by breaking the silos, as has been mentioned here, right? And enabling the right environments for academia to act as a knowledge broker. So on that note, there needs to be some language change, right? Perhaps sometimes as researchers, we're immersed in our bubble with our own language and problems, right? So peer review and scientific rigorous criticisms are essential in scholarship. However, when we're engaging with the policymakers and society, there needs to be a change in language towards more actionable and more effective communication with all these players. The triangle that has been mentioned here, in which you have researchers, policymakers, and citizens, society, right? And last but not the least, as an early career researchers, funding and funding bodies and academic institutions, they're leading this effort, right, towards funding projects and sustainable development goals. As an early career researchers, I hope that there can also be small, flexible funding and opportunities so that junior researchers can contribute with novel and bold ideas in this dialogue. And yeah, so I look forward to future debates, either online or hopefully in person next time.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I just wanted to add that you sit on the EuroScience Science Policy Working Group, don't you? So I just want to say to all the audience out there that EuroScience has this science policy working group, which explores issues like this, but other areas as well, and has other working groups to explore other types of issues as well. So if anyone out there is really interested in joining the discussion on a sort of more, in our working groups, then please visit the website and contact the EuroScience office, and I'm sure that they can put you in touch with the chairs of those working groups. I just want to do some closing remarks, which really are just to say thank you to everyone for participating. So thank you so much for the panelists for giving up your time, not just this morning, but also I know that this requires a lot of preparation beforehand to think about what you're going to say. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Christina for your wonderful opening remarks. Thank you very much to all the audience for your suggestions, your comments and so forth. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to read out all of them. There were a lot of comments on funding and they are visible in the chat. So I'm really sorry that I couldn't raise all of those questions verbally in the discussion. I'd also like to thank the organisers, the people that enabled this session to happen, from the sort of leaders, if you like, that gathered together and realised a session like this was necessary, but also to all the people from behind the scenes who have enabled us to have this chat today. And thank you.